Good, good. So we're going to continue our study with of Joshua. You know, I thought about doing some other stuff, but it's a very interesting study to me, and I've been studying it quite a bit. So you've heard the old song, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Hey, Joshua didn't have a big part in that, you know. It was God. Joshua didn't. In fact, the walls collapsed on themselves. And if you've ever seen a picture, and I was thinking about doing one today, but it's hard for me to do both. But we'll maybe next week show you a picture of Jericho now. But Jericho, of course, is just a kind of a big mound of dirt now, where all the stuff over the years is built up. But the wall around Jericho, which was a fairly small place, I've kind of calculated it out from the metric measurements, and it was about 200 feet. About 200 yards by about 700 yards. So small, probably smaller than Glenville, you know. But it was tightly populated. It was a city. In fact, some people say it was the oldest city on earth. They think it's one of the oldest cities on earth. So this battle, so-called battle, was not Joshua's, it was the Lord's. The walls around Jericho, they've been determined by archaeology because the Bible doesn't seem to think that's that important. But the walls around Jericho, there was like a 30-foot embankment, steep embankment. And on top of that embankment was like an 8-foot mud brick wall. So you can imagine what that would have been, trying to charge up that hill and take that city by just military means alone. And the Israelites, even though they were armed, had very little training, and they had no war machines or anything like that. It was all hand to hand. And you know, the defenders had every advantage. They had the spears, the swords, the bow and arrows, the fire, the whatever they used, rocks, whatever they used to defend themselves. So you can imagine, just think about that, how difficult that would have been for a human, even with God assisting. So when we left Joshua last, he was on his face praying before this being that showed up and said, "I'm the commander of the army of the Lord." And it was either Jesus himself or an angel or an appearance by God himself. But Joshua went out to survey the city and see what kind of task he had, because I'm sure he was dreading it. You could look at that and think, I'm going to lose a lot of people here. But when he seen this commander of the host of the Lord, his worry kind of went away. So kind of like stepping on sunglasses, only a lot bigger. But later the writer would say, the Lord gave Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and the Lord gave them rest on every side. So that was what was said after the conquest. So when we have a promise from the Lord that if we'll do a certain thing his way, that it'll turn out good, we should listen to that. We should listen closely to that. Because we all have our own selfish desires to go our own way. And a lot of times we'll just ignore that and we'll do what we please. And according to what Paul said, you know, you whatever you do, it comes back on you. That's basically what he said in Romans 1. So they were led by God from their camping place facing the sea earlier. They went through the sea, the Red Sea, because of divine intervention. They came across the desert, all of that because of divine intervention. They lived on manna, otherwise they would have starved. And the Egyptians were doomed when they tried to stop them. And later they're attacked by the Amalekites at Rephidim. Moses tells Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek." So it's interesting how God, even when he does these things, at least up here, the humans have a place. And we all have a place in the battle of the Christian battle. We all have a place. And the main place is faith. And that's what the Israelites had here. They had faith. So at this earlier battle, the Israelites were actually fighting, and Moses was overlooking it from the top of a hill. And when Joshua was down there fighting, and so when these two priests would hold Moses' hands up because they got so tired he couldn't hold them up, if they let the hands fall, they'd start losing. As long as them hands was in the air, they'd win. And it showed faith and it showed perseverance. So the divine element wasn't missing in that battle either. But here, it's almost totally the divine element. So Joshua was Moses' assistant from the time they left Egypt. And so he learned all this stuff. He learned how to obey God. He was one of the most faithful men in the Bible. In fact, Moses himself wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because he disobeyed the Lord. And he let his anger control him like we all do sometimes. But Joshua was a faithful guy. I mean, it talks about at the end of Joshua how, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. He tells the Israelites, you got your choice. You can serve God or you can serve idols, but I'm going to serve the Lord. So here we got verse 1 that Robert read earlier. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went in and none came out. So it was a city under siege. People had locked the gates, no commerce going in and out. Nobody was going in and out. Farmers weren't going out to tend their fields. They were shut up. They hoped they had enough food to last. And all of a sudden, these Israelites, by all the rules of normal military engagement, they expected these Israelites to come climbing up that embankment any minute. And when they showed up out there, that's what they were expecting. I'm sure they had been preparing weapons all night and eating plenty of food and getting plenty of exercise and having lots of water up there to drink because they expected a big battle. So, but they also knew that the waters of the Jordan had parted and let the Israelites through. So they'd already seen the miracles. So why would you continue to fight against a God you knew could do it, whereas all their idols were just useless pieces of clay? Why would you do that? Because they're hard-hearted, and people are hard-hearted today, you know. It said in verse 3, you shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once, thus you shall do for 6 days. And then he gives them all these instructions afterwards. They're to do it in a certain way, because that's the way God wanted. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and priests shall blow their trumpets. Verse 4. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every one straight before him. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. And he said to the people, go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord, just as Joshua had commanded the people. The 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark while the trumpets blew continually. There was a large group of armed men who went in front. Then you had the priests blowing these 7 ram's horns. You can just imagine being up on the city wall and you're hearing that, and you're thinking, well, any minute they're going to turn and charge, or they're going to try to open the gates or something. But can you imagine what they felt like? That after 6 days, they just did that once a day. Once a day, they'd come around and they'd probably spend a couple hours marching around the city. Then they'd go home to the camp. And the people in the city said, wow, we've made it another day. But they had to know that something was going on strange and not good. And so every day, you know, the first day they did it, they went back the second day they did it. They did it exactly the same. Everybody was silent too. At that time, usually armed men that were fighting a war would shout, scream, and holler everywhere they went to kind of help frighten the enemy. And they'd blow trumpets and they'd do all this stuff. But they just marched silently. They never opened their mouths. And I don't know, I kind of visualize them in military precision, you know, wearing their armor or not, but I don't know that. I mean, they could have just looked like sheep herders. I don't know. But it doesn't matter here. But anyway, 7 is the divine number. It's listed through the Bible as being the number of perfection because it took 7 days for the earth to be created and all that. So it means completeness. So on the last day, it was a little different. And so at the end of the on the 7th day, you know, I'm sure somebody come running to the king and said, "They're at it again." And he said, "I know, I hear them, I done hear them went around, it'll be fine." Well, they're going around again. They're going, and then this 3rd time, it's like, they're going around again, something bad's gonna happen. But, you know, we're fine, and they ain't even killed nobody yet. We'll be fine. And then they made 6 circuits, and they're thinking, how in the world do these people do that? It must be hot out there. And they're probably having them another glass of wine or something. But on the 7th circuit, all the people shouted. And they turned, and that mud brick wall just fell down over the embankment. And archaeology tells you the exact same thing. Now, all archaeologists don't agree on it. There was a lady back in the 50s named Kathleen Kenyon who dug there. And she tried to say, no, it's impossible for this to be Joshua's war because it happened 100 years later or something. But she got it wrong because the evidence is there. There's still ash left in the city of Jericho. The walls are still laying where they fell. So this must have seemed really ineffective, really irrelevant from a human point of view. Because from a human point of view, you'd be making sure your men were fed, you'd be making sure they knew what they were doing, and you'd be making sure you had a strategic plan for taking the city. In fact, at that time, sometimes it took 2 or 3 years to take a city. They put the city under siege, they try to cut off the food and water, and they just let them starve. And there's one place in the Bible where people in the city were eating their children because there was nothing left to eat. And so, yeah, that's how they normally took it, because normally these walls were impregnable. There was nothing they had that could break them down. So the New Testament, Hebrews 11:30 says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they'd been encircled for 7 days. By faith, not by arms. It was done by faith. So here in 8:14, it focuses on the execution of these commands. And so I'm sure it's kind of repeated because the writer wants to emphasize the dramatic effect of this. And just as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark while the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, you shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about it once. And they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. You know, this reminded me, I went to a school one time in the military, and it was a school about tactics and stuff. So you spent the time in the field, and it was like a mock war. And the way they designed it is the chain of command gets replaced a lot. The guy gets killed who's in command. So it failed to me at one point. So here I am with all this company of men, and they're in different places and all. And I had a plan already in my mind to take the objective we had. But guess how many people really obey you when you're like that? There's always somebody who wants to do something on their own, change timing and things like that. So you can imagine Joshua here had a very disciplined army. I mean, they listened to what he said. Nobody was talking. You know, normally if you got if you got a few hundred men marching, somebody's going to be whispering to each other. I mean, even the most disciplined army, you guys know that we're in the military, because a lot of people in the military, even though it's a very disciplined organization and people are supposed to do what they say, it's full of rebels, because only rebels want to fight a war. It is. I mean, most people are not they're not yes people, even though they have to be in this time. So the covenant of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant was there in the middle. And you see later in the Bible where the Ark of the Covenant is very important. That's God's presence at that time. God's presence was there at the Ark of the Covenant. So you can imagine the seventh time when they shouted, how the people felt inside the city, especially when the walls started falling out from under them. I mean, it was probably a panic, and it was reserved to the very end. This big shout. Can you imagine that many people shouting? Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually. And the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned into the camp. So they did for 6 days. So we all know what happened on the 7th day. We've just been talking about it, but the Bible don't give us any more details. They marched around the city 7 times. Now, it was a small city, but it's probably getting late in the afternoon when they finally did the 7th round. And so this kind of links to stuff that happened later on in the book of Joshua, and we'll get to that. So it is important. On the 7th day they rose early at the dawn of day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priest had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city, and the city that all is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom you sent. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord." Y'all remember who Rahab is? Rahab was the lady who hid the Israelite spies, on the roof of her house and covered them up with flax to where the king's army couldn't find them. And because of that, and because she showed faith in God, she wasn't trying to do anything. She showed faith in God. And because of that, her and her whole household and all of her relatives were saved out of all these people. Now, when they talk about devoted things, the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. So, when God's wrath falls, it's only by His grace that anyone can survive. Now, these people, it's been determined they did child sacrifice. They did all manner of pornographic activity. They were savages in a lot of ways. These people deserve to die. And, we do too. We may not do things like that, but we do things just as bad. But these people had every opportunity. They had heard about the crossing of the Red Sea. They knew these people had the Ark of the Covenant. They knew these people had a God that actually worked, that actually did what He said. And they knew that other people who had faced them had failed. They had watched them cross the Jordan while it was backed up, and yet they still rebelled. They could have went out and made peace, but they didn't even try to do that. In fact, later on, the Gibeonites came and tricked the Israelites into making peace with them, but the Israelites honored that peace agreement and didn't kill them. So they had the opportunity. It was not it was not, as a lot of atheists now say, it wasn't just God being a slaughterer type of thing. But Rahab, because of her faith, was rescued, and the rest of the city and its treasures were destroyed, as previously commanded to Moses. So devoted things are things set apart for God. So Joshua was told that all this stuff in the city was set apart for God. It wouldn't be used for personal use. The treasures were to go into the Lord's treasury. The rest of it was to be destroyed. And I'm sure it hurt some of them Israelites when they seen these fine things they had to destroy. When they seen these people they had to destroy. But they had the faith in God to know that what God had determined absolutely for destruction, it was to be done. And you know, to us that seems impossibly cruel, that they'd kill every man, woman, child, and animal in the city, which they did. But we got to remind ourselves that everything belongs to God. Everything. And if He wants to destroy something, it's His. If He wants to destroy us, we're His. And the people today are subject to God's wrath. Our society today ain't a whole lot different than that was when you think about it. When you look around, a lot of the stuff that we kind of take for granted now, we know it's happening out there. Not Christians doing it, but we know it's happening. It's Jericho. It's Jericho today. And a lot less things happen too that, you know, Jesus said sin, sin. So, you know, we can expect God's wrath. And the only thing keeping us from God's wrath is the cross of Christ. Is Christ giving His sacrifice. You know, there's a lot of preaching today going on about how, you know, come to Jesus, He's just so loving, and He's going to make your life so much better, and you'll go to heaven. The fact is, if you don't, you're going to die and go to hell. I mean, that's the facts. So the Apostle Paul writes, has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show His wrath and to make known His power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? And so we have no answer to God for that. That's God. You know, it's like Paul's using an example here. It's like if a guy just made a clay pot on the potter's wheel and he don't like the looks of it, he just kind of knocks it down and starts forming it again. Or if it dries and he don't like it, he throws it in the garbage. So the divine justice of the Canaanite conquest is a strong theme in the Old Testament. God promised the land to Abraham's descendants in Genesis 15:16, and he also tells them it'll be several generations before it happens, because He says the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete, but the time will come when it is. And Moses taught the people in Deuteronomy 9:5, not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, that He might confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So judgment was God's final resort here. It had been generations since He made these promises, and He could have just went ahead and destroyed them then, and it would have been it. By all these things, the nations I'm driving out before you have become unclean, and the land become unclean. So I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Leviticus 18:24. So these things were set apart. They were devoted for God's wrath. They were His property exclusively, not anyone else's. The Israelites didn't own anything until God gave it to them. And so that was the purpose of that. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. Leviticus 27:18. And so the Canaanite paganism is what doomed them. And not only just that, but the fact that they refused to change. They refused to bend in the wind. You know, they could have done that. So they had not received the law, but like all of us, if we didn't know what the Ten Commandments were, if we didn't know who Jesus was, like a lot of people in the world don't, we still know what's right and wrong. People in the middle of a jungle that have never seen anything civilized know that it's wrong to kill somebody. They know it's wrong to sleep with their neighbor's wife. They know, because it's kind of built into us to know. Once again in Romans, Paul says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. Romans 1, 19, 20. So you look outside and you see those trees. That should tell you that God exists. You don't have to come up with some kind of evolutionary theory, because you know. So Hebrews 11 says, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she'd given a friendly welcome to the spies. So they were disobedient. They seen what God had done in Egypt. They seen how God had destroyed the Pharaoh's army. They heard, at that time there was a little more distance, and there weren't any cell phones. There weren't any telegraphs or none of that, but people got around, and people brought news. Traders would have been coming into Jericho all the time telling these tales about the Israelites. Can you imagine what kind of people they are? And they're coming this way, by the way. You better get ready, because they're coming this way. But they chose in the opposition to Rahab, they chose to be rebellious and to refuse to believe and to refuse to see what their own eyes was telling them. So they had hardened their heart, like Pharaoh had hardened his heart against Pharaoh. And according to the way the Bible reads about Pharaoh, God kind of caused that. So if you got a tendency to have a hard heart, God can make it even harder for you and make it harder for them to believe. So they chose to resist. And so to keep any of this stuff that the Israelites got would have been crossing God, would have been bringing his wrath down. And we'll see in a later story that kind of did happen. We know that at least one guy did, because it would make you liable to destruction if you did that. The actual fall of Jericho is recorded with a minimal description in verse 20. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown, and as soon as the people heard the shout of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. Can you imagine the outcry today if the Israelites did that in Gaza? It would be like they would be the bottom rung in all the world. But hanging in the window of one house was a scarlet cord. And Joshua had already instructed his guys, don't touch that house. In fact, afterwards, to go to her house and bring her out. And that's what they did. Not only her, but it says, because of her faith, she and all belong to her are saved alive, verse 25. And then she's lived in Israel to this day. So they brought her out, and her family began outside the camp in Israel, but later on they were brought in. And guess who Rahab's the ancestor to? And we all know that. She's the ancestor of Jesus. So God had a plan for Christ even then. God has a plan. His plan lies for all the years that the earth's been here. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her, and they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and gold, the vessels of bronze and iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent out to spy Jericho. So if you'll notice there, you have to kind of pay attention. All who belonged to her. So her slaves, employees, anybody who had connection to Rahab was saved. It wasn't just her family. It was all who belonged to her. Her animals, all her people. If she had a dozen employees, we don't know. If she had a bunch of girls there that were prostitutes too, they were saved too. So, when you have a feeling to look down on people, Just remember that, you know. God can save anybody, and he does. So Jericho was overcome by the power of God. All they had to do was a mopping up. And then later, here at the end, Joshua laid an oath on them at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds his city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So that did happen later on. And the guy did lose his youngest son, and he did lose his firstborn because of it. And well, that's a whole nother story. So where does this leave us as Christian believers? We can't go destroy a city because the people are evil. We shouldn't want to, because we shouldn't want to destroy anybody. Evil is rampant in our world right now. It's probably just as bad as it was then, but because we're God's people, we're set apart. You know, we're like a small group of people in Rahab's house when all the rest of the city is paganism going on. So, writing to the Corinthians, Paul says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." So our warfare, I'm sorry, I have trouble with that word. Our warfare is against ideas, and it's against spirits, and it's against these powers in the heavenlies. He says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm." So we don't do a holy war as Christians. Our battle is on our knees. You know, our battle is prayer, and we fight against the opposition to the gospel. That's what we do. So it's not jihad, but Jesus who wins the victory. We're different from one of them other religions. In fact, Jesus said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven." Now, I've heard people say, well, how could God be like he was at Jericho and then be like he was with Jesus? Well, that's God's plan, and I'm not going to question it in any way. So our battle is beyond all this. It's out there. It's in another dimension. Our battle is not with swords. It's with our prayers and with our faith, mainly our faith. So, you know, if you fall down to that level where you're fighting them battles on the human scale, like we sometimes all do, you know, we're just kind of falling into the devil's plan. Now, on the other hand, the Bible doesn't tell us to be pacifists. In fact, Jesus said, "Give unto Caesar what's Caesar." So if we have to fight in a war, that's our obligation. He didn't tell us not to defend ourselves. In fact, Jesus told his followers to get some swords when they went on a journey. So there's a lot of groups that misunderstand that, and they teach it a little differently. But we need to search out, listen to, and adopt a divine strategy for victory. And so we don't know sometimes why we all are called to do something that we don't necessarily want to do on our own, but we have an obligation to show our faith. And nothing is outside of his sovereign control. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And Charles Spurgeon said, "If everything works together for our good, then nothing is left to work to our ill." So no matter what happens to you, he's got you. And no one would have thought of no one would have thought of God's Jericho strategy. We would never have thought of that. But that's God's plan. And you know, a lot of times we substitute our own plans for God's priorities, and that's what we got to watch out for. We have to show our faith and walk that line. And thank you for listening. I've probably been a little longer than I normally am, but this is one I really enjoy teaching the Bible. That it's also teaching history, things that happened in our world. Thank you, Lord. Thank you so much for your plans for us and for faith, and help us to show our faith for whatever we do, to support each other as we live in Jericho, in Canaan, and help us, Lord, each day to share our faith with our families, friends, and even strangers. We give you the praise this day, and help us, Lord, to enjoy each other's fellowship. In Jesus' name.